An absolute distinction may never be drawn, not even subjectively. Suppose that A has something to say about his fellow craftsman B, and suppose that certain achievements of B are to be valued. If now A has been working in the same field as B, he must not depreciate too much the value of B's work, since otherwise his own work is in danger of the same low valuation. Objectively, the converse is true. For if A bulls the general efficiency of his trade, it doesn't serve his conceit, since we find simply that the competitor is in this way given too high a value. It would be inadvisable to give particular examples from special trades, but everybody who has before him one figulus after another, from the lowest to the highest professions, and who considers the statements they make about each other, will grant the correctness of our contention. I do not, at this point, either assert that the matter is the same in each and every case, but that it is generally so is indubitable. There is still another thing to be observed. A good many people, who are especially efficient in their trades, desire to be known as especially efficient in some other and remote circle. It is historic that a certain regent was happy when his very modest flute playing was praised. A poet was pleased when his miserable drawings were admired. A marshal wanted to hear no praise of his victories, but much of his very doubtful declamation. The case is the same among lesser men. A craftsman wants to shine with some foolishness in another craft, and the Philistine is happiest when he is considered a devil of a fellow. The importance of this fact lies in the possibility of error in conclusions drawn from what the subject himself tries to present about his knowledge and power. With regard to the past, it leads even fundamentally honest persons to deception and lying. So, for example, a student who might have been the most solid and harmless in his class later makes suggestions that he was the wildest sport. The artist who tried to make his way during his cubhood most bravely with the hard-earned money of his mother is glad to have it known that he was guilty as a young man of unmitigated nonsense. And the ancient dame who was once the most modest of girls is tickled with the flattery of a story concerning her magnificent flirtations. When such a matter is important for us, it must be received with great caution. To this class of people who want to appear rather more interesting than they are, either in their past or present, belong also those who declare that everything is possible and who have led many a judge into vexatious mistakes. This happens especially when an accused person tries to explain away the suspicions against him by daring statements concerning his great achievements, e.g., in going back to a certain place or his feats of strength, etc., and when witnesses are asked if these are conceivable. One gets the impression in these cases that the witnesses under consideration suppose that they belittle themselves and their point of view if they think anything to be impossible. They are easily recognized. They belong to the worst class of promoters and inventors or their relations. If a man is studying how to pay the national debt or to solve the social question, or to irrigate Sahara, or is inclined to discover a dirigible airship, a perpetual motion machine, or a panacea, or if he shows sympathy for people so inclined, he is likely to consider everything possible. And men of this sort are surprisingly numerous. They do not, as a rule, carry their plans about in public, and hence have the status of prudent persons. But they betray themselves by their propensity for the impossible in all conceivable directions. If a man is suspected to be one of them, and the matter is important enough, he may be brought during the conversation to talk about some project or invention. He will then show how his class begins to deal with it, with what I might call a suspicious warmth. By that token you know the class. They belong to that large group of people who, without being abnormal, still have passed the line which divides the perfectly trustworthy from those unreliable persons who, with the best inclination to tell the truth, can render it only as it is distorted by their clouded minds. These people are not to be confused with those specific men of power who, in the attempt to show what they can do, go further than in truth they should. There are indeed persons of talent who are efficient and know it, whether for good or evil, and they happen to belong both to the class of the accused and of the witness. The former show this quality in confessing to more than they are guilty of, or tell their story in such a way as to more clearly demonstrate both their power and their conceit, so that it may happen that a man takes upon himself a crime that he shares with 3 accomplices, or that he describes a simple larceny as one in which force had to be used with regard to its object and even with regard to the object's owner, or perhaps he describes his flight or his opponents as much more troublesome than these actually were or need have been. The witness behaves in a similar fashion and shows his defense against an attack, for example, or his skill in discovery of his goods, or his detection of the criminal in a much brighter light than really belongs to it. He even may describe situations that were superfluous in order to show what he can do. In this way, the simplest fact is often distorted. As suspects, such people are particularly difficult to deal with. Aside from the fact that they do more and actually have done more than was necessary, they become unmanageable and hard-mouthed through unjust accusations. Concerning these people, the statement made 100 years ago by Ben David 8 still holds. Persecution turns wise people raw and foolish, and kindly and well-disposed ones cruel and evil-intentioned. There are often well-disposed natures who, after troubles, express themselves in the manner described. It very frequently happens that suspects, especially those under arrest, alter completely in the course of time, become sullen, coarse, passionate, ill-natured, show themselves defiant and resentful to even the best-willed approach, and exhibit even a kind of courage in not offering any defense and in keeping silent. Such phenomena require the most obvious caution, for one is now dealing apparently with powerful fellows who have received injustice. Whether they are quite guiltless, whether they are being improperly dealt with, or for whatever reason the proper approach has not been made, we must go back to proceed in another fashion and absolutely keep in mind the possibility of their being innocent in spite of serious evidence against them. These people are mainly recognizable by their mode of life, their habitual appearance, and its expression. Once that is known, their conduct in court is known. In the matter of individual features of character, the form of life, the way of doing things is especially to be observed. Many an effort, many a quality can be explained in no other way. The simple declaration of Volkmar, "There are some things that we want only because we had them once," explains to the criminalist long series of phenomena that might otherwise have remained unintelligible. Many a larceny, robbery, possibly murder, many a crime springing from jealousy, many sexual offenses become intelligible when one learns that the criminal had at one time possessed the object for the sake of which he committed the crime, and having lost it, had tried with irresistible vigor to regain it. What is extraordinary in the matter is the fact that considerable time passes between the loss and the desire for recovery. It seems as if the isolated moments of desire sum themselves up in the course 8 of time and then break out as the crime. In such cases, the explaining motive of the deed is never to be found except in the criminal's past. The same relationship exists in the cases of countless criminals whose crimes seem at bottom due to apparently inconceivable brutality. In all such cases, especially when the facts do not otherwise make apparent the possible guilt of the suspect, the story of the crime's development has to be studied. Gustav Struve asserts that it is demonstrable that young men become surgeons out of pure cruelty, out of desire to see people suffer pain and to cause pain. A student of pharmacy became a hangman for the same reason, and a rich Dutchman paid the butchers for allowing him to kill oxen. If, then, one is dealing with a crime which points to extraordinary cruelty, how can one be certain about its motive and history without knowing the history of the criminal? This is the more necessary inasmuch as we may be easily deceived through apparent motives. Inasmuch as in most capital crimes 2 or more motives work together, an ostensible and a concealed one, says Krauss, 88. Each criminal has at his command apparent motives which encourage the crime. We know well enough how frequently the thief excuses himself on the ground of his need, how the criminal wants to appear as merely acting in self-defense during robberies, and how often the sensualist, even when he has misbehaved with a little child, still asserts that the child had seduced him. In murder cases even, when the murderer has confessed, we frequently find that he tries to excuse himself. The woman who poisons her husband, really because she wants to marry another, tells her story in such a way as to make it appear that she killed him because he was extraordinarily bad, and that her deed simply freed the world of a disgusting object. As a rule, the psychological aspect of such cases is made more difficult, by the reason that the subject has, in a greater or lesser degree, convinced himself of the truth of his statements, and finally believes his reasons for excuse altogether or in part. And if a man believes what he says, the proof that the story is false is much harder to make, because psychological arguments that might be used to prove falsehood are then of no use. This is an important fact which compels us to draw a sharp line between a person who is obviously lying and one who does believe what he says. We have to discover the difference, inasmuch as the self-developed conviction of the truth of a story is never so nine-deep rooted as the real conviction of truth. For that reason, the person who has convinced himself of his truth artificially watches all doubts and objections with much greater care than a man who has no doubt whatever in what he says. The former, moreover, does not have a good conscience, and the proverb says truly, "A bad conscience has a fine ear." The man knows that he is not dealing correctly with the thing, and hence he observes all objections, and the fact that he does so observe cannot be easily overlooked by the examining officer. Once this fine hearing distinguishes the individual who really believes in the motive he plausibly offers the court, there is another indication, obviously quite apart from the general signs of deceit, that marks him further, and this comes to light when one has him speak about similar crimes of others in which the ostensible motive actually was present. It is said rightly that not he is old who no longer commits youthful follies, but he that no longer forgives them, and so not merely he is bad who himself commits evil, but also he who excuses them in others. Of course, that an accused person should defend the naked deed as it is described in the criminal law is not likely for conceivable reasons, since certainly no robbery suspect will sing a paean about robbers, but certainly almost anybody who has a better or a better appearing motive for his crime will protect those who have been guided by a similar motive in other cases. Every experiment shows this to be the case, and then apparent motives are easily enough recognized as such. Somatic character units. Section: General considerations. When we say that the inner condition of men implies some outer expression, it must follow that there are series of phenomena which especially mold the body in terms of the influence of a state of mind on external appearance, or conversely, which are significant of the influence of some physical uniqueness on the psychical state, or of some other psychophysical condition. As an example of the first kind, one may cite the well-known phenomenon that devotees always make an impression rather specifically feminine. As an example of the second kind is the fact demonstrated by Jurkovecki 89 that impotents exhibit disagreeable characteristics. Such conditions find their universalizing expression in the cruel but true maxim 0, beware of the marked one. The Bible was the first of all to make mention of these evil stigmata. No one, of course, asserts that the bearer of any bodily malformation is for that reason invested with one or more evil qualities. Non cum hoc, sed propter hoc. It is a general quality of the untrained, and hence the majority of men, that they shall greet the unfortunate who suffers from some bodily malformation not with care and protection, but with scorn and maltreatment. Such propensities belong, alas, not only to adults, but also to children, who annoy their deformed playfellows, whether expressly or whether because they are inconsiderate, and continually call the unhappy child's attention to his deformity. Hence, there follows in most cases from earliest youth, at first a certain bitterness, then envy, unkindness, stifled rage against the fortunate, joy in destruction, and all the other hateful similar qualities, however they may be named. In the course of time, all of these retained bitter impressions summate, and the qualities arising from them become more acute, become habitual, and at last you have a ready-made person marked for evil. Add to this the indubitable fact that the marked persons are considerably wiser and better instructed than the others. Whether this is so by accident or is causally established is difficult to say. But inasmuch as most of them are compelled just by their deformities to deprive themselves of all common pleasures and to concern themselves with their own affairs, once they have been fed to satiety with abuse, scorn, and heckling, the latter is the more likely. Under such circumstances, they have to think more, they learn more than the others to train their wits, largely as means of defense against physical attack. They often succeed by wit, but then they can never be brought into a state of good temper and lovableness when they are required to defend themselves by means of sharp, biting, and destructive wit. Moreover, if the deformed is naturally not well disposed, other dormant evil tendencies develop in him, which might never have realized themselves if he had had no need of them for purposes of self-defense, lying, slander, intrigue, persecution by means of unpermitted instruments, etc. All this finally forms a determinate complex of phenomena which is undivorceably bound in the eyes of the expert with every species of deformity, the mistrusting of the deaf man, the menacing expression of the blind, the indescribable and therefore extremely characteristic smiling of the humpback are not the only typical phenomena of this kind. All this is popularly known and is abnormally believed in, so that we often discover that the deformed are more frequently suspected of crime than normal people. Suspicion turns to them especially when an unknown criminal has committed a crime, the accomplishment of which required a particularly evil nature, and where the deed of itself called forth general indignation. In that case, once a deformed person is suspected, grounds of suspicion are not difficult to find. A few collect more, as a rolling ball does snow. After that, the sweet proverb, vox populi vox Dei, drives the unfortunate fellow into a chaos of evidential grounds of suspicion, which may all be reduced to the fact that he has red hair or a hump. Such events are frightfully frequent. 90 section. Causes of irritation. Just as important as these phenomena are the somatic results of psychic irritation. These latter clear up processes not to be explained by words alone, and often overvalued and falsely interpreted. Irritations are important for two reasons, as causes of crime and as signs of identification in examination. In regard to the first, it is not necessary to show what crimes are committed because of anger, jealousy, or rage, and how frequently terror and fear lead to extremes otherwise inexplicable. These facts are partly so well known, partly so very numerous and various, that an exposition would be either superfluous or impossible. Only those phenomena will be indicated which lie to some degree on the borderland of the observed and hence may be overlooked. To this class belong, for example, anger against the object, which serves as explanation of a group of so-called malicious damages, such as arson, etc. Everybody, even though not particularly lively, remembers instances in which he fell into great and inexplicable rage against an object when the latter set in his way some special difficulties or caused him pain, and he remembers how he created considerable ease for himself by flinging it aside, tearing it, or smashing it to pieces. When I was a student, I owned a very old, thick Latin lexicon, Kirshi Cornucopia, bound in wood covered with pigskin. This respectable book flew to the ground whenever its master was vexed, and never failed profoundly to reduce the inner stress. This Kirsius was inherited from my great-grandfather, and it did not suffer much damage. When, however, some poor apprentice tears the fence, on a nail of which his only coat got a bad tear, or when a young peasant kills the dog that barks at him menacingly and tries to get at his calf, then we come along with our damages according to so and so much, and the fellow hasn't done any more than I have with my Kirsius. 9. In the magnificent novel, Auch einer, by F.T. Vischer, there is an excellent portrait of the perversity of things. The author asserts that things rather frequently hold ecumenical councils with the devil for the molestation of mankind. How far the perversity of the inanimate can lead. I saw in a criminal case in which a big isolated haystack was set on fire. A traveler was going across the country and sought shelter against oncoming bad weather. The very last minute before a heavy shower, he reached a haystack with a solid straw cover, crept into it, made himself comfortable in the hay, and enjoyed his good fortune. Then he fell asleep, but soon woke again, inasmuch as he, his clothes, and all the hay around him was thoroughly soaked, for the roof just above him was leaking. In frightful rage over this evil perversity, he set the stack on fire, and it burned to the ground. It may be said that the fact of the man's anger is as much a motive as any other, and should have no influence on the legal side of the incident. Though this is quite true, we are bound to consider the crime and the criminal as a unit, and to judge them so. If under such circumstances we can say that this unit is an outcome natural to the character of mankind, and even if we say, perhaps, that we might have behaved similarly under like circumstances, if we really cannot find something absolutely evil in the deed, the criminal quality of it is throughout reduced. Also, in such smaller cases, the fundamental concept of modern criminology comes clearly into the foreground. Not the crime, but the criminal is the object of punishment, not the concept, but the man is punished. List. The fact of the presence of a significant irritation is important for passing judgment, and renders it necessary to observe with the most thorough certainty how this irritation comes about. This is the more important inasmuch as it becomes possible to decide whether the irritation is real or artificial and imitated. Otherwise, however, the meaning of the irritation can be properly valued only when its development can be held together step by step with its causes. Suppose I let the suspect know the reason of suspicion brought by his enemies. Then if his anger sensibly increases with the presentation of each new ground, it appears much more natural and real than if the anger increased in inexplicable fashion with regard to less important reasons for suspicion, and developed more slowly with regard to the more important ones. The collective nature of somatic phenomena in the case of great excitement has been much studied, especially among animals, these being simpler and less artificial, and therefore easier to understand, and in the long run comparatively like men in the expression of their emotions. Very many animals, according to Darwin, erect their hair or feathers or quills in cases of anxiety, fear, or horror, and nowadays indeed involuntarily, in order to exhibit themselves as larger and more terrible. The same rising of the hair even today plays a greater role among men than is generally supposed. Everybody has either seen in others or discovered in himself that fear and terror visibly raise the hair. I saw it with especial clearness during an examination when the person under arrest suddenly perceived with clearness, though he was otherwise altogether innocent, in what great danger he stood of being taken for the real criminal. That our hair rises in cases of fear and horror without being visible is shown, I believe, in the well-known movement of the hand from forehead to crown. It may be supposed that the hair rises at the roots invisibly, but sensibly, and thus causes a mild tickling and pricking of the scalp, which is reduced by smoothing the head with the hand. This movement, then, is a form of involuntary scratching to remove irritation. That such a characteristic movement is made during examination may therefore be very significant under certain circumstances. Inasmuch as the process is indubitably an influence of the nerves upon the finer and thinner muscle fibers, it must have a certain resemblance to the process by which, as a consequence of fear, horror, anxiety, or care, the hair more or less suddenly turns white. Such occurrences are in comparatively large numbers historical. G. Pouchet 9 counts up cases in which hair turned white suddenly, among them one where it happened while the poor sinner was being led to execution. Such cases do not interest us because, even if the accused himself turned gray overnight, no evidence is afforded of guilt or innocence. Such an occurrence can be evidential only when the hair changes color demonstrably in the case of a witness. It may then be certainly believed that he had experienced something terrible in aging, but whether he had really experienced this, or merely believed that he had experienced it, can as yet not be discovered, since the belief and the actual event have the same mental and physical result. Properly to understand the other phenomena that are the result of significant irritation, their matrix, their aboriginal source must be studied. Spencer says that fear expresses itself in cries, in hiding, sobbing, and trembling, all of which accompany the discovery of the really terrible, while the destructive passions manifest themselves in tension of the muscles, gritting of the teeth, extending the claws, all weaker forms of the activity of killing. All this, aboriginally inherited from the animals, occurs in rather less intense degrees in man, inclusive of bearing the claws, for exactly this movement may often be noticed when somebody is speaking with anger and vexation about another person, and at the same time extends and contracts his fingers. Anybody who does this even mildly and unnoticeably means harm to the person he is talking about. Darwin, indeed, in his acutely observing fashion, has also called attention to this. He suggests that a man may hate another intensely, but that so long as his anatomy is not affected, he may not be said to be enraged. This means clearly that the somatic manifestations of inner excitement are so closely bound up with the latter that we require the former whenever we want to say anything about the latter. And it is true that we never say that a man was enraged or only angry if he remained physically calm, no matter how noisy and explicit he might have been with words. This is evidence enough of the importance of noticing bodily expression. How characteristic, says Volkmar 9, is the trembling and heavy breathing of fear, the glowering glance of anger, the choking down of suppressed vexation, the stifling of helpless rage, the leering glance and jumping heart of envy. Darwin completes the description of fear. The heart beats fast, the features pale, he feels cold but sweats, the hair rises, the secretion of saliva stops, hence follows frequent swallowing, the voice becomes hoarse, yawning begins, the nostrils tremble, the pupils widen, the constrictor muscles relax. Wild and very primitive people show this much more clearly and tremble quite uncontrolled. The last may often be seen and may indeed be established as a standard of culture and even of character, and may help to determine how far a man may prevent the inner irritation from becoming externally noticeable. Especially he who has much to do with gypsies is aware how little these people can control themselves. From this fact also spring the numerous anecdotes concerning the wild rulers of uncultivated people, who simply read the guilt of the suspect from his external behavior, or even more frequently were able to select the criminal with undeceivable acuteness from a number brought before them. Bain 9 narrates that in India, criminals are required to take rice in the mouth and after a while to spit it out. If it is dry, the accused is held to be guilty. Fear has stopped the secretion of saliva. Obstupui, stedetunt come, et vox faucibus hessit. Concerning the characteristic influence of timidity, see Paul Hartenberg 9. Especially self-revealing are the outbreaks of anger against oneself, the more so because I believe them always to be evidence of consciousness of guilt. At least I have never yet seen an innocent man fall into a paroxysm of rage against himself, nor have I ever heard that others have observed it, and I would not be able psychologically to explain such a thing should it happen. Inasmuch as scenes of this kind can occur perceivably only in the most externalized forms of anger, so such an explosion is elementary and cannot possibly be confused with another. If a man wrings his hands until they bleed or digs his fingernails into his forehead, nobody will say that this is anger against himself. It is only an attempt to do something to release stored-up energy, to bring it to bear against somebody. People are visibly angry against themselves only when they do such things to themselves as they might do to other people. For example, beating, smashing, pulling the hair, etc. This is particularly frequent among Orientals who are more emotional than Europeans. So I saw a gypsy run his head against a wall, and a Jew throw himself on his knees, extend his arms and box his ears with both hands so forcibly that the next day his cheeks were swollen. But other races, if only they are passionate enough, behave in a similar manner. I saw a woman, for example, tear whole handfuls of hair from her head. A murdering thief, guilty of more or fewer crimes, smash his head on the corner of a window, and a 17-year-old murderer throw himself into a ditch in the street, beat his head fiercely on the earth, and yell, "Hang me! Pull my head off!" The events in all these cases were significantly similar. The crime was so skillfully committed as conceivably to prevent the discovery of the criminal. The criminal denied the deed with the most glaring impudence and fought with all his power against conviction. In the moment, however, he realized that all was lost. He exerted his boundless rage against himself, who had been unable to oppose any obstacle to conviction, and who had not been cautious and sly enough in the commission of the crime. Hence the development of the fearful self-punishment, which could have no meaning if the victim had felt innocent. Such expressions of anger against oneself often finish with fainting. The reason of the latter is much less exhaustion through paroxysms of rage than the recognition and consciousness of one's own helplessness. Reichenbach 9 once examined the reason for the fainting of people in difficult situations. It is nowadays explained as the effect of the excretion of carbonic acid gas and of the generated anthropotoxin. Another explanation makes it a nervous phenomenon in which the mere recognition that release is impossible causes fainting, the loss of consciousness. For our needs, either account of this phenomenon will do equally. It is indifferent whether a man notices that he cannot voluntarily change his condition in a physical sense, or whether he notices that the evidence is so convincing that he cannot dodge it. The point is that if, for one reason or another, he finds himself physically or legally in a bad hole, he faints, just as people in novels or on the stage faint when there is no other solution of the dramatic situation. When anger does not lead to rage against oneself, the next lower stage is laughter. 9. With regard to this point, Darwin calls attention to the fact that laughter often conceals other mental conditions than those it essentially stands for: anger, rage, pain, perplexity, modesty, and shame. When it conceals anger, it is anger against oneself, a form of scorn. This same wooden, dry laughter is significant, and when it arises from the perception that the accused no longer sees his way out, it is not easily to be confused with another form of laughter, One gets the impression that the laughter is trying to tell himself, that is what you get for being bad and foolish. Section. Cruelty. Under this caption must be placed certain conditions that may, under given circumstances, be important. Although apparently without any relations to each other, they have the common property of being external manifestations of mental processes. In many cases, they are explanations which may arise from the observation of the mutative relations between cruelty, bloodthirstiness, and sensuality. With regard to this, older authors like Mitchell, 98, Bloomroeder, 99, Friedreichsruhe, have brought examples which are still of no little worth. They speak of cases in which many people, not alone men, use the irritation developed by greater or lesser cruelty for sexual purposes. The torturing of animals, biting, pinching, choking the partner, etc. Nowadays, this is called sadism. 0. Certain girls narrate their fear of some of their visitors who make them suffer unendurably, especially at the point of extreme passion, by biting, pressing, and choking. This fact may have some value in criminology. On the one hand, certain crimes can be explained only by means of sexual cruelty, and on the other, knowledge of his habits with this regard may, again, help toward the conviction of a criminal. I recall only the case of Balog Steiner in Vienna, a case in which a prostitute was stifled. The police were at that time hunting a man who was known in the quarter as Chicken Man, because he would always bring with him 2 fowls which he would choke during the orgasm. It was rightly inferred that a man who did that sort of thing was capable, under similar circumstances, of killing a human being. Therefore, it will be well, in the examination of a person accused of a cruel crime, not to neglect the question of his sexual habits, or better still, to be sure to inquire particularly whether the whole situation of the crime was not sexual in nature. In this connection, deeds that lead to cruelty and murder often involve forms of epilepsy. It ought therefore always to be a practice to consult a physician concerning the accused, for cruelty, lust, and psychic disorders are often enough closely related. About this matter, Lombroso is famous for the wealth of material he presents. Section. Nostalgia. The question of homesickness is of essential significance and must not be undervalued. It has been much studied, and the notion has been reached that children mainly, in particular during the period of puberty, and idiotic and weak persons suffer much from homesickness and try to combat the oppressive feeling of dejection with powerful sense stimuli. Hence they are easily led to crime, especially to arson. It is asserted that uneducated people in lonesome, very isolated regions, such as mountain tops, great moors, coast country, are particularly subject to nostalgia. This seems to be true and is explained by the fact that educated people easily find diversion from their sad thoughts, and in some degree take a piece of home with them in their more or less international culture. In the same way, it is conceivable that inhabitants of a region not particularly individualized do not so easily notice differences. Especially he who passes from one city to another readily finds himself, but mountain and plain contain so much that is contrary that the feeling of strangeness is overmastering. So then, if the homesick person is able, he tries to destroy his nostalgia through the noisiest and most exciting pleasures. If he is not, he sets fire to a house or, in case of need, kills somebody. In short, what he needs is explosive relief. Such events are so numerous that they ought to have considerable attention. Nostalgia should be kept in mind where no proper motive for violence is to be found, and where the suspect is a person with the above-mentioned qualities. Then again, if one discovers that the suspect is really suffering from homesickness, from great homesickness for his local relations, one has a point from which the criminal may be reached. As a rule, such very pitiful individuals are so less likely to deny their crime in the degree in which they feel unhappy that their sorrow is not perceivably increased through arrest. Besides that, The legal procedure to which they are subjected is a not undesired, new and powerful stimulus to them. When such nostalgics confess their deed, they never, so far as I know, confess its motive. Apparently, they do not know the motive, and hence cannot explain the deed. As a rule, one hears, "I don't know why, I had to do it." Just where this begins to be abnormal must be decided by the physician, who must always be consulted when nostalgia is the ground for a crime. Of course, it is not impossible that a criminal, in order to excite pity, should explain his crime as the result of unconquerable homesickness. But that must always be untrue because, as we have shown, anybody who acts out of homesickness does not know it and cannot tell it. Section 8. Reflex movements. Reflex actions are also of greater significance than as a rule they are supposed to be. According to Lotze, reflex actions are not limited to habitual and insignificant affairs of the daily life. Even compounded series of actions which enclose the content even of a crime may come to actuality in this way. In a single moment in which the sufficient opposition of some other emotional condition, the enduring intensity of emotion directed against an obstacle, or the clearness of a moving series of ideas is lacking, the deed may emerge from the image of itself without being caused or accompanied by any resolve of the doer. Hearings of criminals are full of statements which point to such a realization of their crimes, and these are often considered self-exculpating inventions, inasmuch as people fear from their truth a disturbance or upsetting of the notions concerning adjudication and actionability. The mere recognition of that psychological fact alters the conventional judgment but little. The failure in these cases consists in not having prevented that automatic transition of images into actions, a transition essentially natural to our organism, which ought, however, like so many other things, to be subjected to power of the will. Reflex movements require closer study. Part 0. The most numerous and generally known are dropping the eyelids, coughing, sneezing, swallowing, all involuntary actions against approaching or falling bodies. Then again, the patellar reflex and the cremaster reflex, etc. Other movements of the same kind were once known and so often practiced that they became involuntary. Hence, for example, the foolish question how a person believed to be disguised can be recognized as man or woman. The well-known answer is, let some small object fall on his lap. The woman will spread her limbs apart because she is accustomed to wear a dress in which she catches the object. The man will bring his limbs together because he wears trousers and is able to catch the object only in this way. There are so many such habitual actions that it is difficult to say where actual reflexes end and habits begin. They will be properly distinguished when the first are understood as single detached movements, and the last as a continuous, perhaps even unconscious and long-enduring action. When I, for example, while working, take a cigar, cut off the end, light it, smoke, and later am absolutely unaware that I have done this, what has occurred is certainly not a reflex, but a habitual action. The latter does not belong to this class, in which are to be grouped only such as practically bear a defensive character. As examples of how such movements may have criminological significance, only one's own AD experience may be cited, because it is so difficult to put oneself at the point of view of another. I want to consider two such examples. One evening I passed through an unfrequented street and came upon an inn just at the moment that an intoxicated fellow was thrown out and directly upon me. At the very instant, I hit the poor fellow a hard blow on the ear. I regretted the deed immediately, the more so as the assaulted man bemoaned his misfortune. Inside they throw him out, outside they box his ears. Suppose that I had at that time burst the man's eardrum or otherwise damaged him heavily. It would have been a criminal matter, and I doubt whether anybody would have believed that it was a reflex action, though I was then, as today, convinced that the action was reflex. I didn't in the least know what was going to happen to me and what I should do. I simply noticed that something unfriendly was approaching, and I met it with a defensive action in the form of an uppercut on the ear. What properly occurred I knew only when I heard the blow and felt the concussion of my hand. Something similar happened to me when I was a student. I had gone into the country hunting before dawn, when some 100 paces from the house, right opposite me, a great ball rolled down a narrow way. Without knowing what it was or why I did it, I hit at the ball heavily with an alpenstock I carried in my hand, and the thing emerged as two fighting tomcats with teeth fixed in each other. One of them was my beloved possession, so that I keenly regretted the deed. But even here I had not acted consciously. I had simply smashed away because something unknown was approaching me. If I had then done the greatest damage, I could not have been held responsible, if my explanation were allowed. But that it would have been allowed, I do not believe in this case either. A closer examination of reflex action requires consideration of certain properties, which in themselves cannot easily have criminal significance, but which tend to make that significance clearer. One is the circumstance that there are reflexes which work while you sleep. That we do not excrete during sleep depends on the fact that the feces pressing in the large intestine generates a reflexive action of the constrictors of the rectum. They can be brought to relax only through especially powerful pressure or through the voluntary relaxation of one's own constrictors. The second suggestive circumstance is the fact that even habitual reflexes may, under certain conditions, especially when a particularly weighty different impression comes at the same time, not take place. It is a reflex, for example, to withdraw the hand when it feels pain, in spite of the fact that one is so absorbed with another matter as to be unaware of the whole process. But if interest in this other matter is so sufficiently fixed as to make one forget, as the saying goes, the whole outer world, the outer impression of pain must have been very intense in order to awaken its proper reflex. The attention may, however, not be disturbed at all, and yet the reflex may fail. If we suppose that a reflex action is one brought about through the excitement of an afferent sensory nerve, which receives the stimulation and brings it to the center from which the excitement is transferred to the motor series, Landau, we exclude the activity of the brain. But this exclusion deals only with conscious activity, and the direct transition through the reflex center can happen successfully only because the brain has been consciously at work innumerable times, so that it is cooperating in the later cases also without our knowing it. When, however, the brain is brought into play through some other particularly intense stimuli, it is unable to contribute that unconscious cooperation, and hence the reflex action is not performed. On this point I have, I believe, an instructive and evidential example. One of my maids opened a matchbox pasted with paper at the corner by tearing the paper along the length of the box with her thumbnail. Apparently the box was overfilled, or the action was too rapidly made, for the matches flamed up explosively and the whole box was set on fire. What was notable was the fact that the girl threw the box away neither consciously nor instinctively. She shrieked with fright and kept the box in her hand. At her cry, my son rushed in from another room, and only after he had shouted as loudly as possible, "Throw it away! Drop it!" did she do so. She had kept the burning thing in her hand long enough to permit my son to pass from one room into another, and her wound was so serious that it needed medical treatment for weeks. When asked why she kept the burning box in her hand, in spite of really very terrible pain, she simply declared that she didn't think of it, though she added that when she was told to throw the thing away, it just occurred to her that that would be the wisest of all things to do. What happened then was obviously this. Fear and pain so completely absorbed the activity of the brain that it was not only impossible for it consciously to do the right thing, it was even unable to assist in the unconscious execution of the reflex. 8. This fact suggests that the sole activity of the spinal cord does not suffice for reflexes, since if it did, those would occur even when the brain is otherwise profoundly engaged. As they do not so occur, the brain also must be in play. Now, this distinction is not indifferent for us, for if we hold that the brain acts during reflexes, we have to grant the possibility of degrees in its action. Thus, where brain activity is in question, the problem of responsibility also arises, and we must hold that wherever a reflex may be accepted as the cause of a crime, the subject of the degree of punishment must be taken exceptionally into account. It is further to be noted that as a matter of official consideration, the problem of the presence of reflexes ought to be studied, since it rarely occurs that a man says, "It was purely a reflex action." He says, perhaps, "I don't know how it happened," or "I couldn't do otherwise," or he denies the whole event because he really was not aware how it happened. That the questions are here difficult, both with regard to the taking of evidence and with regard to the judgment of guilt, is obvious, and it is therefore indifferent whether we speak of deficiency in inhibition centers or of ill will and malice. Section 9. Dress. It is easy to write a book on the significance of a man's clothes as the expression of his inner state. It is said that the character of a woman is to be known from her shoe, but actually the matter reaches far beyond the shoe, to every bit of clothing, whether of one sex or the other. The penologist has more opportunity than anyone else to observe how people dress, to take notes concerning the wearer, and finally to correct his impressions by means of the examination. In this matter, one may lay down certain axioms. If we see a man whose coat is so patched that the original material is no longer visible, but the coat nowhere shows a hole, if his shirt is made of the very coarsest and equally patched material, but is clean, and if his shoes are very bad but are whole and well polished, we should consider him and his wife as honest people, without ever making an error. We certainly see very little wisdom in our modern, painfully attired sports. We suspect the suggestively dressed woman of some little disloyalty to her husband, and we certainly expect no low inclinations from the lady dressed with intelligent, simple respectability. If a man's general appearance is correct, it indicates refinement and attention to particular things. Anybody who considers this question finds daily new information and new and reliable inferences. Anyway, everybody has a different viewpoint in this matter, a single specific detail being convincing to one, to another only when taken in connection with something else, and to a third when connected with still a third phenomenon. It may be objected that at least detailed and prolonged observations are necessary before inferences should be drawn from the way of dressing, inasmuch as a passing inclination, economic conditions, etc., may exert no little influence by compelling an individual to a specific choice in dress. Such influence is not particularly deep. A person subject to a particular inclination may be sufficiently self-exhibiting under given circumstances, and that he was compelled by his situation to dress in one way rather than another is equally self-evident. Has anybody seen an honest farm hand wearing a worn-out evening coat? He may wear a most threadbare, outworn sheepskin, but a dress coat he certainly would not buy, even if he could get it cheap, nor would he take it as a gift. He leaves such clothes to others whose shabby elegance shows at a glance what they are. Consider how characteristic are the clothes of discharged soldiers, of hunters, of officials, etc. Who fails to recognize the dress of a real clerical, of democrats, of conservative aristocrats? Their dress is everywhere as well defined as the clothing of Englishmen, Frenchmen, Germans, and Americans, formed not by climatic conditions, but by national character in a specific and quite unalterable way. Conceit, carelessness, cleanliness, greasiness, anxiety, indifference, respectability, the desire to attract attention and to be original. All these and innumerable similar and related qualities express themselves nowhere so powerfully and indubitably as in the way people wear their clothes. And not all the clothes together. Many a time a single item of dress betrays a character. Section 0. Physiognomy and related subjects. The science of physiognomy belongs to those disciplines which show a decided variability in their value. In classical times it was set much store by, and Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, and Pythagoras were keenly interested in its doctrines. Later on it was forgotten, was studied in passing when Baptista Porta wrote a book about human physiognomy, and finally, when the works of Lavater VIII and the closely related ones of Gall appeared, the science came for a short time into the foreground. Lavater's well-known monograph, '08, excited great attention in his day and brought its author enthusiastic admiration. How much Goethe was interested in it is indicated in the popular book by von der Hellen and the exchange of letters between Goethe and Lavater. If Lavater had not brought the matter into relation with his mystical and apodictic manner, if he had made more observations and fewer assertions, his fame would have endured longer, and he would have been of some use to the science. As it was, it soon slipped from people's minds, and they turned to the notorious phrenology of Gall. Gall, who to some degree had worked with his friend Spurzheim, committed the same error in his works '09 as Lavater, inasmuch as he lost himself in theories without scientific basis, so that much that was indubitably correct and indicative in his teaching was simply overlooked. His meaning was twice validated, once when B.V. Cotta and R.R. Noel studied it intensively and justly assigned him a considerable worth. The second tune when Lombroso and his school invented the doctrine of criminal stigmata, the best of which rests on the postulates of the much scorned and only now studied Dr. Gall. The great physiologist J. Miller declared, concerning the general possibility of the principles of Gall's system, no a priori objections can be made. Only recently were the important problems of physiognomy, if we accept the remarkable work by Schack, scientifically dealt with. The most important and significant book is Darwin's, then the system of Piderit and Carus's Symbolic, all of them being based upon the earlier fundamental work of the excellent English anatomist and surgeon, Bell. Other works of importance are those of Lebrun, Reich, Mantegazza, Dr. Duchenne, Scraup, Magnus, Jessman, Chebest, Engel, Schneider, K. Michel, Wundt, Seelang, Giraudet, A. Mosso, A. Baer, Wiener, Lotze, Waits, Lillot, Monroe, Huizinga, Herbart, Meinert, Goltz, Hughes, Eightbore, etc. The present status of physiognomics is, we must say, a very subordinate one. Phrenology is related to physiognomics as the bony support of the skull to its softer ones, and as a man's physiognomy depends especially upon the conformation of his skull, so physiognomics must deal with the forms of the skull. The doctrine of the movement of physiognomy is mimicry. But physiognomics concerns itself with the features of the face taken in themselves, and with the changes which accompany the alterations of consciousness, whereas mimicry deals with the voluntary alterations of expression and gesture which are supposed to externalize internal conditions. Hence, mimicry interests primarily actors, orators, and the ordinary comedians of life. Phrenology remains the research of physicians, anthropologists, and psychologists, so that the science of physiognomy, as important in itself, is left to us lawyers. Its value as a discipline is variously set. Generally, it is asserted that much, indeed, fails to be expressed by the face, that what does show, shows according to no fixed rules, that hence, whatever may be read in a face is derivable either instinctively by oneself or not at all. Or, it may be urged, the matter cannot be learned. 8 such statements, as ways of disposing of things, occur regularly wherever there is a good deal of work to do. People do not like to bother with troublesome problems, and therefore call them worthless. But whoever is in earnest and is not averse to a little study will get much benefit from intensive application to this discipline in relation to his profession. The right of physiognomies to the status of an independent science is to some degree established in the oft-repeated dictum that whatever is valid in its simplest outline must be capable of extension and development. No man doubts that there are intelligent faces and foolish ones, kind ones and cruel ones, and if this assertion is admitted as it stands, it must follow that still other faces may be distinguished, so that it is possible to read a certain number of spiritual qualities from the face. And inasmuch as nobody can indicate the point at which this reading of features must cease, the door is open to examination, observation, and the collection of material. Then, if one bewares of voluntary mistakes, of exaggeration and unfounded assertion, if one builds only upon actual and carefully observed facts, an important and well-grounded discipline must ensue. The exceptionally acute psychiatrist Meinert shows 8 how physiognomics depends on irradiation and parallel images. He shows what a large amount of material having physiognomical contents we keep in mind. Completely valueless as are the fixed forms by which mankind judges the voluntary acts of its individual members, they point to the universal conclusion that it is proper to infer from the voluntary acts of a person whose features correspond to those of another, the voluntary acts of the other. One of Hans Virchow's very detailed physiognomical observations concerning the expression of interest in the eyes by means of the pupil has very considerable physiognomical value. The pupil, he believes, is the gate through which our glance passes into the inner life of our neighbor. The psychical is already close at hand with the word inner. How this occurs, why rather this and not another muscle is innervated in the development of a certain process, we do not know, but our ignorance does not matter, since ultimately a man might split his head thinking why we do not hear with our eyes and see with our ears. But to some extent we have made observable progress in this matter. As far back as A.D.J. Miller 9 wrote, "The reasons are unknown why various psychoses make use of different groups of nerves, or why 8 certain facial muscles are related to certain passions." Gracioletto thought it necessary 40 years ago to deny that muscles were developed merely for the purpose of expression. Almost contemporaneously, Piderit knew that expressive muscular movements refer partly to imaginary objects and partly to imaginary sense impressions. In this fact lies the key to the meaning of all expressive muscular movements. Darwin's epoch-making book on the expressions of the emotions finally established the matter so completely and firmly that we may declare ourselves in possession of enough material for our purpose to make it possible to carry our studies further. The study of this book of Darwin's Mon, I believe absolutely necessary to each criminalist, for he meets in every direction expositions and explanations that are related to cases he has already experienced in practice or is sure to experience. I present here only a few of Darwin's most important notes and observations in order to demonstrate their utility for our purpose. As subjects for study, he recommends children because they permit forms of expression to appear vigorously and without constraint. Lunatics, because they are subject to strong passions without control. Galvanized persons, in order to facilitate the muscles involved, and finally to establish the identity of expression among all races of men and beasts. Of these objects, only children are important for our purpose. The others either are far removed from our sphere of activity or have only theoretic value. I should, however, like to add to the subjects of observation another, viz.,